There is a place where silence became policy, where human voices were reduced to echoes behind steel doors. A prison not defined by riots or chaos, but by something colder: control. Marion Federal Penitentiary was never meant to become a symbol. But in the early 1980s, something happened inside those walls that would quietly reshape the entire American prison system. Because what happens when a prison decides that the only way to maintain order is to eliminate freedom entirely? Before we step inside, take a moment to subscribe and share where you're watching from. This story reaches far beyond these walls, and it connects more than you might expect. The prison that wasn't supposed to matter. Marion, Illinois. A small town, quiet and unassuming. But just beyond its edges stood a facility that would become a turning point in American corrections. Opened in 1963, Marion Federal Penitentiary was originally designed to replace the infamous Alcatraz. It wasn't supposed to be brutal. It wasn't meant to be experimental. It was simply meant to be secure. At first, it functioned like many other high-security prisons. Inmates worked jobs. They moved through controlled routines. There was structure, but also a sense, however limited, of normalcy. But Marion held a different kind of population. Men who had already proven difficult to contain. Escape risks. Violent offenders. Those who had already challenged authority elsewhere. And slowly, something began to shift. The rules inside Marion weren't just written by administrators. They were shaped by the inmates themselves. The unwritten code. Inside Marion, survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about understanding the code. There were lines you didn't cross, questions you didn't ask, alliances that could protect you or destroy you. Race played a central role. Inmate groups often organized along racial lines, forming tight-knit factions that controlled territory, resources, and influence. Trust wasn't given freely. It was earned through loyalty, silence, and sometimes violence. Guards maintained order on the surface. But beneath that, another system operated quietly. If someone disrespected the code, consequences came swiftly. Sometimes it was a warning. Other times it was something far worse. Meals were eaten quickly. Eyes stayed alert. Even something as simple as walking down a corridor carried risk. Because in a place like Marion, danger didn't announce itself. It waited. Tension beneath control. By the late 1970s, Marion had begun to change. Violence was increasing. Tensions between inmate groups were rising. And the balance between control and chaos was becoming harder to maintain. Guards weren't just enforcing rules. They were navigating a constant undercurrent of threat. Some officers developed a hardened approach. Others tried to maintain professionalism. But over time, the environment affected everyone. There were assaults, stabbings, retaliations that rippled through cell blocks. And with each incident, the administration tightened control. Privileges were reduced. Movement became more restricted. Surveillance increased. But the question lingered. Was control preventing violence or fueling it? The breaking point. October 22nd, 1983. It started like any other day. Routine movements. Controlled interactions. Nothing unusual on the surface. But inside Marion, tension had been building for months. That day, it erupted. 2 correctional officers were attacked and killed in separate incidents within hours of each other. The violence was sudden, coordinated, and deeply unsettling. For the administration, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a signal. Something inside Marion had broken. And the response would change everything. The lockdown begins. In the immediate aftermath, Marion went into lockdown. At first, it was temporary. But days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And eventually, something unprecedented happened. The lockdown never ended. Inmates were confined to their cells for nearly 23 hours a day. Movement was severely restricted. Interaction was minimized. Meals were delivered through slots in steel doors. Recreation, if allowed at all, took place in small, isolated enclosures. This wasn't a short-term response. It became a permanent condition. Life inside the lockdown. Imagine waking up every day in the same confined space. No meaningful human contact. No movement beyond a few steps. Time begins to blur. In Marion's lockdown, routine still existed, but it was stripped down to its barest form. Wake up.
Eat. Sit. Wait.
The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Some inmates coped by reading. Others exercised in the limited space available. But many struggled. Because isolation doesn't just restrict the body. It reshapes the mind. What happens to a person when days turn into months and months into years without real interaction? The answer isn't simple. But inside Marion, the effects were impossible to ignore. The guards behind the doors. The lockdown didn't just affect inmates. It changed the role of correctional officers as well. Instead of managing movement and interaction, their job became one of constant surveillance, monitoring, enforcing, containing. Some officers felt the system was necessary. They believed it prevented further violence. Others questioned it, because working in an environment built on isolation came with its own psychological toll. Communication between staff and inmates became minimal. Tension lingered in every interaction. And over time, a different kind of distance formed, not just physical but human, control or consequence. From the outside, Marion's lockdown appeared effective. Violence dropped significantly. Order was maintained. But at what cost? Critics argued that the system created more problems than it solved. Prolonged isolation, they said, led to mental deterioration, increased anxiety, loss of social functioning. Supporters, however, saw it differently. They believed Marion had found a solution to a difficult problem. If certain individuals posed extreme risks, shouldn't extreme measures be used? The debate grew, and people began to pay attention. The birth of a new model. Marion didn't just change itself. It became a blueprint. In the years that followed, the concept of long-term lockdown evolved into what would later be known as the Supermax model. Facilities designed specifically for isolation. Control units where inmates could be held indefinitely under strict conditions. One of the most well-known examples would come later, but its roots trace back to Marion. The idea was simple. Total control. Minimal risk. But as this model spread, so did the questions. Was this the future of incarceration? Or a step too far? Voices from inside. Accounts from those who lived through Marion's lockdown offer a glimpse into its reality. Some described it as manageable, a necessary adjustment to survive. Others spoke of deep psychological strain, hallucinations, anxiety, a sense of losing track of time. Even strong individuals found themselves affected, because isolation isn't just about being alone. It's about being cut off from conversation, from connection, from anything that reminds you of the outside world. And over time, that absence begins to shape everything. The ripple effect. As the Supermax model expanded, so did scrutiny. Legal challenges emerged. Human rights organizations raised concerns. Was prolonged solitary confinement a violation of basic rights? Could it be justified as a security measure? The answers weren't clear. Different states adopted different approaches. Some embraced the model fully. Others hesitated. But Marion remained a reference point, a place where the line between control and isolation had been pushed further than ever before. The human question. At its core, the story of Marion isn't just about policy. It's about people. Individuals placed in an environment designed to limit interaction, movement, and choice. And the question that lingers is a difficult one. What is the purpose of a prison? Is it punishment, protection, rehabilitation, or something else entirely? Marion forced those questions into the open, not through theory, but through reality. The legacy that remains. Today, the influence of Marion can still be seen. Supermax facilities exist across the country. The principles first applied there continue to shape correctional strategies. But the debate hasn't ended. Research continues. Policies evolve. Perspectives shift. Some argue for reform. Others maintain the necessity of strict control. And in the background, Marion stands as a reminder of what happens when a system reaches its breaking point and chooses a path that changes everything. Final segment. Silence that echoes. In the end, Marion didn't become famous because of what it was. It became significant because of what it did. a prison that responded to violence with silence, a system that chose isolation over interaction, and a moment in time that reshaped how incarceration would be understood for decades to come.
The doors closed.
The movement stopped, and inside those walls, something new began, not with noise, but with silence that still echoes today.
More.
Before the silence, before Marion became synonymous with isolation, it operated under a philosophy that now feels distant. There was movement, purpose, at least in a controlled sense. Inmates worked jobs, manufacturing, cleaning, maintaining the prison itself. These routines weren't just about productivity. They were about structure, a way to pass time, to establish rhythm in a place where time could otherwise feel endless. Work assignments carried status. Some jobs were more desirable than others. They offered small privileges, slightly more freedom of movement, limited interaction, a brief break from the monotony of confinement. And those small differences mattered, because inside Marion, even the smallest advantage could shape an inmate's experience. But as tensions escalated in the late 1970s and early 1980s, these systems began to break down. Work became harder to manage. Movement became riskier. And slowly, the very routines that once kept the prison stable began to disappear. The rise of control units. Even before the permanent lockdown, Marion had already begun experimenting with tighter forms of control. Special housing units, early versions of what would later become control units, were used to isolate certain inmates. These weren't designed for the general population. They were for individuals considered especially dangerous, disruptive, unmanageable under standard conditions. Inside these units, restrictions were heavier. Movement was limited. Interaction was carefully monitored. But what started as a targeted approach soon expanded. Because once isolation proved effective in containing certain individuals, the question became unavoidable. What if it could be applied more broadly? The day everything changed, a closer look. The events of October 22, 1983 weren't random. They were the result of a build-up, weeks, months, even years of tension that had been quietly escalating. Accounts suggest that the attacks on correctional officers were calculated, coordinated in a way that exposed vulnerabilities in the system. For staff, it shattered any remaining sense of predictability. Because if such violence could occur within a controlled environment like Marion, what did that say about the limits of control? The response was immediate, but it was also final. There would be no gradual adjustment, no attempt to restore the previous system. Instead, Marion crossed a line, and there was no going back. A new reality takes hold. After the lockdown became permanent, the prison transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Daily life was reduced to a sequence of isolated moments. A tray arriving through a slot. A brief opportunity to shower alone, under supervision. An hour, sometimes less, in a small recreation cage barely larger than a cell. Communication between inmates became rare, sometimes impossible. Even sound changed. Instead of conversations, there were echoes, distant noises, the occasional shout that traveled through vents and concrete. Over time, many inmates developed ways to adapt. They tapped messages through walls, created routines within their cells, found ways to mark the passing of time. But adaptation didn't mean acceptance. Because beneath the surface, something else was happening. The psychological weight. Isolation has a way of distorting reality. Without regular interaction, the mind begins to fill the gaps. Some inmates reported heightened sensitivity to sound. Others described losing track of days, even weeks. Sleep patterns shifted. Thoughts became repetitive. For some, the silence became overwhelming. For others, it was the absence of control, the inability to change anything about their environment, that weighed heaviest. And then there were those who seemed unaffected on the surface. But even in those cases, the long-term effects were difficult to measure. Because how do you quantify the impact of years spent in near-total isolation? And more importantly, what does it do to a person once they leave? The staff perspective deepens. For correctional officers, the lockdown created a different kind of routine. Less direct confrontation, fewer large-scale incidents, but also less human interaction. Their role became increasingly mechanical.
Check the doors.
Deliver the trays. Monitor behavior.
Repeat.
Some officers appreciated the reduced risk, the predictability. Others found the environment unsettling because the absence of interaction didn't eliminate tension. It changed it. There was always the awareness that behind each door was a person, watching, waiting, adapting in ways that couldn't always be seen. And that uncertainty never fully disappeared. Isolation as policy. What happened at Marion didn't stay at Marion. Administrators, policymakers, and correctional leaders began to study the results. From a purely operational standpoint, the lockdown had achieved something significant. It reduced violence. It established control. And it did so in a way that could be replicated. That last part mattered. Because once a system proves effective, at least in certain metrics, it tends to spread. The idea of isolating the most dangerous inmates wasn't new, but Marion had taken it further. It had shown that an entire facility could function under those conditions. And that realization would shape decisions for years to come. The birth of modern Supermax. In the decades that followed, new facilities were built with Marion's model in mind. Prisons designed from the ground up for control. Cells built to minimize interaction. Systems designed to limit movement. Surveillance integrated into every aspect of daily life. These became known as Supermax prisons, places where isolation wasn't a temporary measure. It was the foundation. And while each facility had its own variations, the core principle remained the same: control through separation. But as these prisons expanded, so did the conversation around them, because the question remained unresolved. Was this progress or a warning? Stories that rarely surface. Some of the most revealing insights into Marion came not from official reports, but from personal accounts. Letters written by inmates. Reflections shared years later. They spoke of coping mechanisms, creating imaginary conversations, replaying memories, finding meaning in small routines. They also spoke of struggle, moments of doubt, frustration, a sense of being disconnected not just from the outside world, but from themselves. These accounts didn't always align. Some described resilience. Others described deterioration. But together, they painted a complex picture, one that couldn't be reduced to simple conclusions. A system that redefined limits. Marion didn't just introduce a new approach. It redefined what was considered acceptable. Before 1983, long-term, widespread lockdowns of this scale were almost unthinkable. After Marion, they became part of the conversation, part of the toolkit. And once a boundary is pushed, it rarely returns to where it was. Instead, it becomes the new reference point, something future decisions are measured against. The question that still remains. Decades later, the legacy of Marion is still being debated. Research has expanded. Perspectives have shifted. But the core question hasn't gone away. How much control is too much? At what point does security begin to conflict with something more fundamental? There are no easy answers. Only perspectives shaped by experience, belief, and interpretation. But Marion ensures that the question is never ignored. Time without movement. In most places, time is marked by change. Sunlight shifting across a room. Conversations starting and ending. The natural rhythm of movement. Inside Marion's lockdown, those markers faded. Time became something abstract, measured not by events, but by repetition. Meals arriving at the same hours. Lights turning on and off. The occasional shuffle of footsteps in the corridor. For many inmates, days began to blur together. Without variation, memory itself could become unreliable. Was something said yesterday or weeks ago? Did a moment even happen at all? And when time loses its structure, something deeper begins to shift. Because without a sense of progression, the future starts to feel distant, almost irrelevant. Communication in isolation. Even in near total isolation, people find ways to connect. At Marion, communication adapted. Voices carried through vents. Messages tapped through walls in coded rhythms. Notes slipped under doors when opportunity allowed. These weren't casual conversations. They were deliberate, measured, often brief, but they mattered because even the smallest exchange could break the weight of silence. At the same time, communication carried risk. Information spread quickly. Tensions could escalate without direct contact. A misunderstanding, amplified by distance, could have consequences. And in a place where interaction was limited, even a few words could carry unusual weight. The body adapts. With movement restricted, inmates began to create routines within the space they had. Exercise became essential. Push-ups, sit-ups, walking in tight circles from wall to wall, not just for physical health, but for mental stability, because routine provided something the environment lacked: control. Some inmates tracked their progress, set personal goals, built structure where none existed. Others struggled to maintain consistency. Motivation is harder to sustain when the environment never changes. And over time, even the most disciplined routines could begin to feel repetitive, even meaningless. The subtle shifts in behavior. Isolation doesn't always produce immediate, visible effects. Often, the changes are gradual. Small shifts in behavior, slight alterations in mood, increased irritability, heightened sensitivity to sound, difficulty concentrating. For some, these changes remained manageable. For others, they intensified. Because in an environment where there are few external distractions, internal thoughts become louder. And without regular interaction to ground those thoughts, they can begin to spiral. What starts as restlessness can become anxiety. What begins as silence can turn into something far more overwhelming. Authority and distance. The relationship between inmates and staff changed under lockdown. There was less direct conflict, but also less understanding. Interactions became transactional. Orders given. Compliance observed. Documentation recorded. The human element, the informal conversations, the moments of recognition largely disappeared. And with that distance came a different kind of tension. Because when people are reduced to roles, guard and inmate, observer and observed, it becomes easier to overlook the complexity on both sides. And harder to build anything resembling trust. When silence becomes normal. One of the most striking aspects of Marion's lockdown was how quickly it became routine. What initially felt extreme gradually became standard. Silence was no longer unusual. Isolation was no longer temporary. It was simply how things were. And that normalization carried its own implications. Because once something becomes routine, it's no longer questioned in the same way. It becomes part of the system. Expected. Accepted. Even if, at one point, it would have seemed unimaginable. The outside world watches. As word of Marion's conditions spread, attention grew. Journalists began to investigate. Advocacy groups raised concerns. The idea of indefinite lockdown, of prolonged isolation, was difficult to ignore. Some viewed it as a necessary evolution. Others saw it as a warning sign. A shift toward a system that prioritized control above all else. Public opinion wasn't unified. It rarely is. But the conversation had begun. And once it started, it couldn't be contained. Legal pressure builds. Challenges to the system began to emerge. Questions about conditions, about duration, about the psychological impact of long-term isolation. Courts were asked to consider something complex. Not just whether the system worked, but whether it was justified. These weren't simple cases. They involved competing priorities. Safety,
rights,
responsibility. And while some rulings addressed specific concerns, they didn't resolve the broader issue. Because the question at the center of it all remained unsettled. Where should the line be drawn? The individuals behind the system. It's easy to talk about systems in abstract terms. Policies, structures, models. But at Marion, every aspect of the lockdown was experienced by individuals, each with their own perspective. For some inmates, the system was something to endure. For others, something to resist. For staff, it was a job, but also an environment they had to navigate daily. And for administrators, it was a solution to a problem that had demanded immediate action. Each viewpoint carried its own logic, its own justification, and its own limitations. A model that couldn't be ignored. As the years passed, Marion's influence became more visible. New facilities adopted similar approaches. Isolation units expanded. Security measures intensified. What had once been an experiment became a standard, not everywhere, not universally, but enough to shape the direction of the system. And once a model spreads, it begins to evolve, refined, adjusted, adapted to different contexts, but always carrying the imprint of where it began. The human cost revisited. With time, more research began to emerge. Studies examining the effects of prolonged isolation. Interviews. Data. Observations. Some findings were consistent. Difficulties with social interaction after release. Challenges in adjusting to less restrictive environments. Others were less clear. Because human responses to isolation vary. Resilience differs. Coping mechanisms differ. But even with variation, the question persisted. Is the cost measurable? And if it is, how should it be weighed? The door that never fully opened. Marion Federal Penitentiary still stands. Its walls unchanged in many ways. But its legacy isn't confined to its physical structure. It exists in policies, in practices, in debates that continue to this day. What began as a response to a moment of crisis became something much larger. A shift in thinking, a redefinition of control, and a reminder that decisions made under pressure can echo far beyond their original intent. The lockdown at Marion didn't just close doors. It opened a path, one that others would follow, one that still raises questions, and one that, even now, has not reached a clear conclusion. Because once a system changes this profoundly, it doesn't simply return to what it was before. It moves forward, carrying everything it has learned and everything it has yet to understand. If this story made you think differently about prisons, control, and the human mind, then you already understand why Marion still matters today. There are more stories like this, stories that reveal what happens behind closed doors, where decisions shape lives in ways most people never see. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, some of the most powerful stories are the ones told in silence.